The first sign that something was wrong was subtle. The air had taken on a new tang, a sharp stench of burning sulfur. The next warning was far more pronounced. The sea burst into life with a terrible roar. The people of the Tongan Islands were quickly forced to grapple with disaster as massive tidal waves surged and raced toward their shores. On this January afternoon in 2022, a strange apocalypse had been unleashed. The mostly underwater Hunga Tonga-Hunga Ha'apai volcano was erupting with fearsome violence. This was a blast like few others, and scientists were blown away by its unique consequences. An underwater volcano caused an event scientists had never seen before. The people of Tonga are used to volcanoes flaring up from time to time. The 170 small islands that make up the nation, only around 25% of them inhabited, are positioned in an especially seismically active part of the Pacific Ocean. The population lives in the vicinity of a dozen active submarine volcanoes, not to mention a bunch more rising on the surface. Tongans are broadly used to ash entering their atmosphere or the seas around their coast as a result of volcanic activity. But January 2022 was different. Nobody was ready for the eruption of Hunga Tonga-Hunga Ha'apai. Tonga has a tiny population, today estimated at about 108,000. Most of its people reside on Tongatapu Island, which is considered to be the main island. It's roughly equivalent in size to Sacramento, California. In economic terms, the country is heavily reliant on agriculture, fishing, and tourism. It produces crops such as squashes, coconuts, and a variety of root vegetables. In other words, it is by no means a wealthy nation. The Hunga submarine volcano had generally been in a dormant state for about 7 years, but at the end of 2021, it started to exhibit signs of sparking into life again. Some 40 miles away in the country's capital of Nuku-Alofa, residents had begun to notice plumes of steam and ash rising from the twin uninhabited islands, marking the volcano's position. The mood on the ground initially appeared to be fairly relaxed, albeit with hints of concern. Many people would look out at the plume and take it in with a drink, but the sense of precarity, for some, was real. Virginie Dauerlet, a teacher from France who lived in Nuku-Alofa at the time, couldn't escape one question inside her head. That question, as she recalled to the Washington Post, was, is the baby island going to survive? But as December gave way to January and the new year of 2022, things seemed to have calmed down. The volcano appeared to become dormant again, and it was officially asserted as such by the Tonga Geological Services on January 11. That relief was short-lived. Just days later, this stench of sulfur blew across Nuku-Alofa. The sky took on most unusual blues and purple hues. It was gorgeous, Dauerlet recalled, but in an impending doom kind of way. And then the sea began to act strangely. Across the coastline, the tides started to pull back and whirlpools began to materialize. Something was wrong, and the people of the islands were experienced enough to know what was about to happen. All the signs were there. A tsunami was brewing. With that fact now plain to see for anyone paying attention, panic naturally began to set in. As Dauerlet put it, people completely freaked out. Early in the morning of January 14, 2022, at around 4:20 a.m., everything finally came to a head. An incredible explosion sounded from Hunga, shaking the ground beneath the people of Tonga's feet. Marian Kupu, a journalist in the village of Kalavai on Tongatapu, did her best to relay to ABC News how that terrifying moment had played out. The first explosion, our ears were ringing, and we couldn't even hear each other, so all we do is pointing to our families to get up, get ready to run, Kupu reported. We evacuated and then we, all our families, were just running away from the Kalavai area because Kalavai is right beside the seashore. Hunga had erupted with incredible violence, and now people across Tonga were facing the dire consequences. For one thing, a terrible tsunami had been generated, and for another, a vast quantity of ash had shot into the sky and was now descending upon the population. The dust is on rooftops, trees, everywhere, Kupu recounted. What we are concerned about now is clean drinking water. Of course, breathing was also an issue. People were encouraged to wear masks. Of course, it wasn't just the people on Tongatapu who were impacted by the eruption. Over on the island of Namuka, a woman named Sela Fatengane had been walking through the woods when she felt the blast rock her home. Her world, in an instant, was about to crumble. Fatengane quickly rushed out of the trees, where she was greeted by a scene of total chaos. Her fellow residents were in a state of panic, fleeing from the coastline and heading towards safer ground. The sea was rapidly flooding their island. Fatengane, who has 2 kids, needed to act fast. Together with her husband, she gathered the children and they all jumped into their car. The road was already out of action because of the flooding, but they needed to get to high ground by any means necessary. They sped off as more explosions shook their island. The noise from these bangs was so loud that it left them temporarily deafened. The flooding sea was literally sweeping away nearby houses. This was a nightmare that had become reality. The sky turned dark and heavy with ash, which soon began to fall upon people. The atmosphere of doom must have been totally overwhelming at this point, and that would only have got worse when Fatengane took note of the drinking water situation. None could be found, which was a problem for everyone, but especially her youngest child. Fatengane was mother to a 4-year-old, but also to an infant, only recently born. And without water, she wasn't able to mix any formula for the baby. Things became so desperate that she needed to ask another woman to breastfeed her daughter. On that day, Fatengane told the Washington Post, "We thought it was the end of the world for us." The situation was dire all across the Tongan Islands. Over on Atat, a guy named Lasala Falau had been taking a walk when the tsunami hit. As the waves crashed over him, he did the only thing he could. He clung onto a tree for dear life. At one stage his son had called out to him, but Falau didn't reply. He was afraid that, if he had, his son might have tried to rescue him and himself be swept away. For fully 27 hours, Falau clamped himself to that tree, knowing that if he ever let go, he would soon be dead. That whole nightmarish time, as he later told the Washington Post, he had one thought in his head: "I can't lose the tree." Elsewhere on Atat, a woman named Elisiva Tuivai and her grandma were also fighting the terrible waves by holding onto trees. It wasn't easy, and their heads would often slip beneath the gushing water. "I was scared I would die," Tuivai later recalled. Thankfully, she and her grandma managed to flee to safety during a rare break in the waves. For a moment, the water pulled back as a new wave formed. Before it crashed down on them, they made their escape and headed for high ground. Atat was badly hit by the tsunami, but obviously it was far from the only island to experience it. Another small one called Mango Island, for example, was dramatically smashed by the waves. Almost everyone across the whole Tongan nation was affected in some way. It's been reported that about 84% of the entire Tongan population was either displaced or suffered damage to their homes and farms. Not only that, but 4 people were killed and far more were injured. Many of the islanders around Tonga who'd managed to survive the night were brought to Tonga Tapu by boat the day after the eruption. They arrived there, in essence, having lost pretty much everything. Their homes were gone. What would they do now? The eruption was so powerful that it announced itself to the rest of the world, too. And not only in the form of news reports. The shock of the explosion could literally be felt as far away as India, some 7,000 miles away. But even though the world knew something big had happened in Tonga, clear information was difficult to come by. Communication networks went down for several days following the eruption, meaning phones and the internet across the islands weren't functioning. On top of that, satellite imagery wasn't able to discern much. Though normally satellites would have had a clear, bird's-eye view of the archipelago, the ash had shrouded the entire area in an impenetrable cloud. A volcano expert named Sam Mitchell spoke to the Washington Post about the confusion that had reigned in the immediate aftermath of the eruption. A member of the faculty at England's University of Bristol, all Mitchell could do was to watch from afar and to attempt to make sense of the images that were coming through. "We couldn't see the impacts on the ground," he said. Was the island just gone? Had the entire population died? Even when the ash cloud disappeared, we still didn't know because the undersea cables were severed, the satellite images were coming out, and we still hadn't heard from them. It was traumatizing. Obviously, the lack of news coming out of Tonga was far more upsetting for people who had relatives living on the islands. Australian resident Tricia Emberson, for instance, had family living in Tonga. She had to wait far too long to learn what their fate had been. She told ABC News, "It's been quite stressful just not knowing what's going on, and the little tidbits of information that you actually see are worrying. I actually had to stop looking at social media." Emberson tried over and over again to make contact with her uncle in Tonga, but for days she just couldn't get through to him. She supposes that she must have placed something like 40 calls over those days, which must have felt both frustrating and horribly ominous. Thankfully in the end, though, she managed to get through. It was about 4 a.m. when finally someone answered the phone, she said, speaking days after the eruption. "I had 3 different numbers I was calling just to hear their voices was really great, but then to hear what they went through was hard." Emberson learned that her relatives had been given little more than 30 minutes to flee their position near the coast and make it to high ground. They had been on Pangamotu Island, which quickly found itself overwhelmed by the tsunami. "The wave came," Emberson said, "and it has just taken everything in the wash." And then once the wave went back, they went and looked for a tarpaulin which they put over the top of them. They slept under that all night until the next day when my husband went to rescue them in his boat. Teacher Dowerlet had also been forced to wait it out on high ground following the tsunami. "When we came down, there was nothing left for us," she told the Washington Post. "Not even our house, our clothes, no food." Rescue workers soon showed up, which was a boon for Dowerlet and her family. But still, they were now homeless. They were forced to sleep in a tent at first, before being placed into an old residence that had survived the waves. When the eruption came to an end, experts quickly got to work analyzing exactly what had just happened. And it didn't take long for them to see that this eruption had been uniquely powerful. It was a record-breaking blast, larger than one that might be caused by a nuclear bomb. The ash that had risen into the air following the eruption reached a height never before seen by scientists. And it wasn't just ash up there, either. As a record amount of water had been fired skywards, too. You could have filled something like 60,000 Olympic swimming pools with it. Another remarkable finding that emerged in the wake of the eruption shows just how insanely powerful it had been. According to researchers, the plume that rose from the volcano generated a vast weather system. That in itself is actually a regular occurrence following a volcanic eruption. The difference here, though, was that the Hunga eruption gave rise to the most intense lightning storm ever recorded. No fewer than 2,600 bolts of lightning were noted every minute at its peak. Nothing like this intensity had ever been seen before. The height that the plume of ash and other material had reached was something like 36 miles. Again, nothing like that has ever been seen before. As an expert from the U.S. Geological Survey put it, this was on another level. It's worth bearing in mind that, while the Hunga eruption was fascinating from a scientific perspective, real people had to live with its consequences. The Tongan population's lives were turned upside down by the event. It must have been terrifying for the people on the ground to see the things they did. The ash plume, the tsunami, and then, on top of everything, the most intense lightning storm ever recorded. Literally 50% of all the lightning noted on Earth at that time happened within the system created by the volcano. The previous record for the most powerful lightning storm generated because of a volcanic eruption had been set in 2009. That episode was 8 times less powerful than this one. And amazingly, the Hunga storm might have been still more severe because it actually fried some of the measuring equipment with its power. Chris Vagaski was one of the researchers involved in the lightning study, and he was evidently blown away by what he found. As a senior member of the Wisconsin Environmental Mesonet and a lightning expert, he, of all people, shouldn't have been surprised by this event, but he was. It had been genuinely unprecedented. The Hunga volcano eruption was a truly extreme event that created conditions that don't occur in traditional thunderstorms or other volcanic eruptions, Vagaski told the Washington Post. It was unlike any lightning event that I've ever seen before, and it will be difficult to surpass. If nothing else, the destruction wrought by the Hunga eruption has made one thing clear. The world needs to be more prepared for the eruption of submarine volcanoes. There are plenty of them dotted around the world, and just because we can't see them, it doesn't mean they can't be totally devastating. As we've seen in Tonga, human lives can be utterly transformed by them. But, as Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute scientist David Clegg told the Washington Post, "We're far from being prepared for events such as this. The current state of monitoring is simply that almost none are monitored at all," he warned. This lack of monitoring is not neglect, but simply that there are many such potentially active submarine volcanoes, and even a single seismometer is expensive to install and to maintain. As the 2-year anniversary of the Hunga eruption approaches, countries that are especially vulnerable to the potential effects of an underwater volcanic eruption remain in a precarious position. Experts believe that there are quite a number of submarine volcanoes that, in specific circumstances, are liable to erupt without warning. Hunga was insanely powerful, but the death toll, thankfully, remained quite low. Any loss of human life is, of course, tragic, but the point is that eruptions like this could be so much worse. Literally hundreds of thousands of people could be at risk around the world. It's unsettling to think about the level of threat underwater volcanoes pose to populations around the world when scientists essentially know so little about them. Only a small number of them have ever been mapped to a significant degree. And their internal workings aren't really understood at all well. Of course, learning about these structures is much easier said than done. They're underwater, after all, so it's not as though they're easy to access. In order to do so, experts need a lot of specialized equipment, and that costs money. For small countries like Tonga, that's just too much to ask. While the equipment required for underwater volcano research is really expensive, that's not the only issue. You also need the right people to operate all this tech, individuals who are appropriately trained. It's complicated stuff, and using it in water, even relatively shallow parts, is really tricky. All this means we're left in our current situation. That is, not really knowing which underwater volcanoes are liable to erupt at any moment. Despite the difficulties involved, this might still be regarded as a massive failing. Lives depend on it. While we may not know which specific volcanoes are especially high risk, scientists do seem to be concerned about those based in the wider western Pacific area. There's a stretch there, beginning close to Japan and extending for 1,740 miles, which seems to be especially dicey. Similarly, the area where Tonga, Fiji, and Samoa all sit seems to be particularly geologically active. The same can be said for the Aleutian Islands of Alaska, which exhibit the same traits as those seen around Hunga. In Europe, the submarine volcano known as Marsilli is thought to be a threat. This thing stands beneath the surface of the Tyrrhenian Sea, just over 100 miles off the shore of Naples. If it erupted, a catastrophe could be on the cards. Modeling undertaken by experts has laid bare the potential threat of a Marsilli eruption. A tsunami could be generated, just as it had been in Tonga. Those waves could then hit heights of 100 feet before crashing into the likes of Sicily and Calabria. According to Kenna Harmony Rubin, a University of Hawaii geochemistry and volcanology professor, submarine volcano monitoring is in its nascency. It is, as she puts it, well behind the state-of-the-art for volcanoes on land. This situation is undoubtedly a massive concern, especially for people who live in at-risk areas. The only upside, perhaps, is that, if submarine volcano monitoring really is in its nascency, it can only improve as time goes on. Assuming, of course, that sufficient resources are dedicated to it. And that's the problem. Given the technology necessary for submarine volcano monitoring to correctly function, huge sums of money would need to be spent. Estimates suggest such an operation would eat up $36,000 daily. As Dr. Clegg pointed out, for the several hundred known submarine volcanoes, such a network is simply too expensive to contemplate. That's a depressing conclusion, considering all the human lives that are at stake. As technology advances, however, there is hope. New generations of cheap sensors should eventually come into being, which would make things an awful lot easier. In the meantime, of course, people just have to pray the submarine volcanoes near them stay quiet. As Dr. Rubin optimistically reflected to the Washington Post, we aren't there yet as a global scientific community, but hopefully the next decade of technology advances allow this to occur. In the present, at-risk countries are having to make do with what they have. Tonga, of course, is more aware than most of the mortal threat that a submarine volcanic eruption can pose, so it's attempting to be proactive about things. In the wake of the Hunga blast, scientists across the island nation have been working hard to install new monitoring equipment. Understandably, people there feel an intense need to get as much warning about volcanic activity as they possibly can. Temperatures around volcanic vents and crevices in Tonga will be monitored by thermal infrared detectors. There will also be devices monitoring volcanic gas levels, a spike in which would indicate something was afoot. Tonga will also introduce something called a synthetic aperture radar. This sensor basically takes note of topographical changes to the ground. Should it begin to swell with magma, those monitoring it will be alerted. As of September 2023, 4 of 8 seismographs scheduled to be placed in Tonga were operational. That's a positive step, to be sure, but there's a problem. The lack of seismographic monitoring up until this point in time means scientists don't really know what normal levels of activity actually look like. And even if all the tech functions as it should and all experts are on their game, monitoring volcanic activity isn't foolproof. Sometimes eruptions can happen with only the smallest amount of warning. Meanwhile, as scientists attempt to wrap their heads around this most remarkable of phenomenons and attempt to prepare for similar events in future, the people of Tonga have been trying to rebuild their lives. And that, as you might understand, hasn't been easy. People were uprooted. They lost their homes, their businesses, and their jobs. The future, as a result of this eruption, is shrouded in doubt for so many Tongans. Tuivai, the woman who alongside her grandma survived by clinging onto a tree during the tsunami, says she and her family have found getting their lives back on track really difficult. They've been rehoused by the government, but they've lost so much. Her mom, Elisivatai Makovi, also spoke to the Washington Post about how difficult their lives had become since the eruption uprooted their lives. "We'll never forget," she said. "This will stay with us forever." Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.